più vicino possibile, il microfono più vicino possibile, e lo mettiamo così nella cima dei fatti. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
No, aspetta un attimo. Okay, so after the bomb, the social implications.
Well, the existence of the atom bomb set a new stage in world history, doubtless. It raised for the first time the prospect, in fact, even the likelihood, that the human capacity for destruction, which was always substantial, might have reached the stage where it would completely destroy human civilization. And that's the cloud that the world has lived under ever since and will live under forever, because once that has been done, there's no way of putting the genie back in the bottle. You can find ways of constraining it and controlling it, but the problem is there. So there's a new problem in human life. We now have the capacity to destroy it easily, and furthermore, that capacity is proliferating and expanding in force. Though it's not, the chances that this will happen may be low at any particular point, over the long run they're not small. That's, of course, only half of it. The level of industrial society has also reached the point that the unrestrained and mindless pursuit of development for greed and profit also has the capacity to destroy human life, and in fact may very well do so before we have a chance to do it with nuclear weapons. That's a parallel problem growing out of the more general problem of industrialization, and in particular of industrial capitalism, which is driven by short-term satisfaction of greed and gives no concern in principle to long-term consequences or effects on others. All of these phenomena, they've always been there, but they reached a new level in the post-war period, and I would say that the existence of the atom bomb is only one part of it. It's dramatic because it focuses the capacity to destroy very explicitly, but I think we should see it as a more general development, something which may prove, in fact, that humans are an evolutionary dead end, kind of a lethal mutation that will destroy themselves and destroy a good deal of the world with them.
Well, as far as, for instance, the university are concerned, with the Second World War, did the way of doing research, and also, I mean, can we say that a new kind of culture, a world culture, was spread all over the country?
Well, there certainly were large-scale social changes and technological and scientific changes during the Second World War. This building where we're talking, in fact, is an example. This building was called at the time the Radiation Laboratory. It was actually developing radar. I suppose they called it the Radiation Laboratory to fool German spies or something, but it was where radar was developed in the electronics laboratory at MIT. And the development of radar, in fact, had a major effect on the war, in particular on the Battle of Britain. So this is a perfect case. MIT during the war was one of the institutions that became essentially a national resource because of the linkage that was established between technology and state violence. Now, the United States was not in the advance path in that respect was Germany. Germany was well in advance of the rest of the world in linking technology to war making. In fact, Germany came, despite its material disadvantages and strategic disadvantages, Germany came unpleasantly close to winning the war because of its enormous advantages in knowledge, skill, technological understanding, and the capacity to link them to war making. The West was not really aware of this until after the war, when they conquered Germany and discovered the enormous extent to which they had succeeded in applying science and technology to the task of destruction and coercion. And in fact, the only reason Germany didn't win the war is because they were simply overwhelmed by the mass of relatively primitive technology that was thrown at them by the West. They couldn't compete with the number of tanks and soldiers and so on. On the technological level, they basically won the war. But the West, England and the United States, were considerably behind in this respect, although that as American industrial power was converted to wartime uses, the balance changed, and by 1945 and in the subsequent period, the United States has been well in advance in the development of technology for the purposes of military destruction and coercion. However, we should bear in mind that this is a two-way street. The relationship between war and technology goes in both directions. Technology is used for war, particularly since the Second World War, in a very sophisticated way. But war is also used for technology. This is particularly dramatic in the United States, where the system of state industrial management since the Second World War, since about 1950, has been to use the Pentagon system as a means for essentially compelling the public to finance and support high technology industry. It's important to remember that in the 1930s, traditional capitalism basically collapsed, and it was understood that it could not possibly be resurrected. The New Deal measures had a very limited effect on overcoming the effects of the Depression. Those effects were, however, overcome by the war, when the government intervened massively to stimulate production and to organize production. That saved the capitalist system from its own self-destruction. And that lesson was taught to the people who could learn it. It was taught to the corporate managers who flocked to Washington to run the totalitarian wartime system. They learned what is later called the lesson of Keynes. They didn't have to read Keynes to learn it. They learned it from their experience, much in the way that the Germans had already learned it. They learned that massive state intervention can maintain a system of private enterprise, which will otherwise self-destruct. And that lesson was carried into the post-war period, as there was a period of pent-up consumer demand which kept the economy going for a few years, but by the late 1940s that was ending. The country was sinking back into recession. There was a lot of concern that we go right back to the Great Depression again, and the natural conclusion was drawn, the conclusion that military spending could be the stimulus that would maintain a state capitalist economy. And that began really officially about 1950 with there's a famous secret document called NSC 68, which now declassified in the 1970s, which essentially set the Cold War in motion. It called for a huge increase in this was right before the Korean War. It called for an enormous increase in military spending, and it gave a whole rather fanciful account about how the Russians were conquering the world and we had to defend ourselves even though we vastly outspent them in armaments and were far richer and so on. But in this connection, the crucial recommendation was that unless there is a government stimulus to production through the military, there will be economic collapse in the United States and Europe. And the Marshall Plan had not achieved its objectives. It had failed. European industry was still pretty well dormant, Japanese almost totally so. And the thought was, plausibly, based in part on the wartime experience, that military production, state-driven production through the military, could rescue the private industrial economy. And that was done. And it's not just weapons, it's virtually all of modern technology. So say take computers, which are the core of any modern industrial society. In the 1950s, computers were not commercially marketable. They had not developed to the point where you could sell them and make a profit. So the public paid for close to 100% of development and production of computers through the military. So it's just a public subsidy for research and development. By the 1960s, the computer industry had reached the point where it could make some profits. So then the technology was handed over to private enterprise so that they could make a profit from it. In the 1980s, there was just the last few years, in fact, there was a new surge in computer technology, which was going to be extremely expensive, new hardware, very elaborate software. Business doesn't want to pay the costs. They want the public to pay the costs. So in fact, there was another big upsurge in military spending, a good bit of which was directed to this purpose. That's much of the purpose of the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars so-called, was as a stimulus to the computer industry. Now it's not, in fact it's much more general. It's true of electronics generally, of lasers, fiber optics. In fact, the cutting edge of technology is subsidized by the public, and the device that's been used is the Pentagon system that pays the costs of research and development, and it provides a state-guaranteed market for waste production. Now, from the point of view of the corporate manager, that's just a gift. It's a gift to the corporate manager from the public, and it's an important gift. In terms of research and development, it's just enormous, and even the market that's provided by the state is significant. And it's a very striking fact that the only parts of the American economy that are competitive internationally are those that are subsidized by the public in this way. High technology industry, which is largely subsidized through the Pentagon system, and capital intensive agriculture, agricultural exports, which are very capital intensive and have a huge government subsidy. Talk about free enterprise is all fine for after dinner speeches or for destroying social programs, but no businessman believes it. They want the public handout from Washington to be secure. So this system of public subsidy and private profit relies very extensively on military production. And in fact, that's what brought about, to a large extent, that did bring about European and Japanese industrial recovery as well. Europe benefited by the fact that the costs were largely paid by the American taxpayer, whereas the benefits went to Europe and then Japan. But this has been there's much more to say about it, but this is a large part of the post-war industrial economy. So to come back to my original point, the connection between technology and war is a two-way street. Technology in the post-Second World War period, Second World War and since, has served to enhance the state's destructive capacity, but reliance on the state's destructive capacity has also been the device by which the public has been compelled to subsidize private industrial enterprise and the development of advanced technology. So it goes both ways. That's a system that's very difficult to take apart. There's a lot of talk these days, in my view, rather loose talk about conversion, replacing the military system by some other system. But I don't think that people have thought through the consequences of that. These are things that business, which is very sophisticated and class conscious, that business circles thought about years ago. Back in the late 1940s, business was already perfectly well aware that it was possible to stimulate the economy through military production or through social spending, and that both would work from a technical economic point of view. But social spending had disadvantages. It redistributed income, it mobilizes people, it organizes new constituencies. In fact, it has all the negative effects of increasing popular democracy and organizing people for social reform, and that's exactly what business doesn't want. The military spending, on the other hand, does none of those things, has none of those negative effects of redistributing income or encouraging people to participate in the democratic process and so on. What it does is just give a gift, public gift to the manager, period. It doesn't interfere with business prerogatives, it doesn't interfere with business domination of the society. And those are the perfectly good social reasons, given that social policy basically has to be meaningfulness to the
Okay.
Start?
Yep.
Well, to summarize, the connection between war and technology is a two-way street. On the one hand, since the Second World War, technology has been mobilized effectively by the state to increase its destructive capacities. On the other hand, war, or the possibility of war, the threat of war, has been used by the state to subsidize the advanced sectors of modern industry, to subsidize high technology, the cutting edge of modern industry. This has been understood. I mean, it has been understood for the last 40 years by, there's a lot of loose talk these days, loose in my view at least, about conversion. That is about, with the reduction of Cold War tensions, of converting a wartime, war-directed industry, military production, to peacetime uses. Now, these questions were raised, discussed, and understood in business circles 40 years ago. Businesses, thoughtful, intelligent, and highly class-conscious. And back in the 1940s, business leaders understood, as well as any technical economist, that alternative modes of government intervention would stimulate the economy just as much as military production does. As Keynes put it, you can bury dollars in the sand and have people dig for them. You can have social spending. There are all kinds of ways for the government to maintain a privately owned economy. Military spending is only one. The problem, however, is that these modes of, while from an economic point of view they're all perfectly feasible, they have different social consequences. Military production is simply a gift to private industry. It's a gift to the corporate manager. The public turns to the corporate manager and says, I will buy any junk that you produce, and I will pay the costs of your research and development, which you don't make profit from, and then I'll hand it over to you and you'll make the profit. It's ideal from the point of view of private ownership. On the other hand, social spending has a range of deleterious effects. It increases democracy, it increases popular participation. If the government becomes involved in building hospitals and schools and so on, people are going to want to have a say in it. They'll become involved. There'll be new constituencies will be organized. There's likely to be redistribution of income. There'll be interference with the prerogatives of the manager. If the government becomes involved in producing anything that's useful in any way, that interferes with the market, with private power. On the other hand, if the government's involved only in producing waste, like armaments, that's fine. No interference with private profit. So for all these reasons, business much preferred military production. It does not have the harmful side effects of increasing democracy, of organizing people, of increasing pressures for social reform. Now, there's sort of a major principle of modern capitalist society, and that is that the state has to be a welfare state for the rich. Social policy has to be primarily designed for the benefit of the wealthy and the powerful, which is not very surprising since they dominate the formation of social policy. And a welfare state for the rich requires military spending, not social spending. That's one of the, in Europe and Japan, this has been a little less obvious, but that's because they're integrated into the American system. They have been, at least in the past, integrated into the American system. It's a world system, and Europe at least, could have a kind of social contract with a degree of welfare, as long as the U.S. economy was driving the system in the early years, largely through military spending. Now, this may change, but the point is, merely shifting from military spending to social spending is not simple. That carries consequences with it, consequences that business is not going to want to accept unless it's forced to accept them.
So you don't think that it would be possible to switch from the military spending to...
No, I don't say it's impossible, but it's going to require social change as well. It will mean that popular constituencies will have to become involved in social planning. There would be an increase in democracy, and after all, one of the major purposes of social planning is to prevent that. It's to keep power in the hands of those who own the society. Now, that goes way back in American history, and in fact, you can trace that back to the English Revolution. I mean, as soon as the modern popular revolutions developed, elite groups organized to try to prevent democratic forms from having any substance. That's one of the major battles of the modern world right up till today. And the current question about conversion is just one instance of it. How do you keep the public from using the formal freedoms that are available to interfere with the power of those who own and direct the society? That's a major problem of the last 3 centuries, increasingly so as democratic forms spread, and there are all kinds of ways devised to do this. One of the best ways is the military. The best way to mobilize, the classic way to mobilize any population is in fear of an external enemy. I mean, that's almost a reflex on the part of any leadership group, way back to prehistoric times, no doubt. And the Cold War, of course, has been very useful, actually for both superpowers, as a means of mobilizing their own populations so that they could carry out the kinds of policies they wanted. The Cold War is, in my view, is very much misinterpreted. I mean, it was in part a superpower conflict, no doubt, but the reality of the Cold War protrudes quite clearly as soon as you look at the typical events of the Cold War. On the Russian side, the Cold War, the typical events are intervention in the satellites, tanks in Berlin and Budapest and Prague and so on. Those are the events of the Cold War. On the U.S. side, the events of the Cold War are global intervention everywhere. Invasion of South Vietnam, overthrowing the government of Guatemala, international terrorism against Cuba. I mean, so many examples, you can't even list them. Those are the events of the Cold War. There's also domestic consequences to the Cold War. Inside the Soviet Union, it entrenched a military bureaucratic elite. Inside the United States, it enhanced the power of private ownership through the military system by the means I've described. It compelled the public to subsidize advanced production. Now, how do you get the public to accept all of this? Well, in fear of the great enemy. In this respect, the Cold War has been highly functional. Now, what's happened now is that one side has called off the game. For all sorts of internal reasons, the Soviet Union can no longer persist in this interaction in which it was always the minor partner. But that doesn't mean the United States is calling off the game. Its part of the Cold War continues. And it is now hoped, in fact, by American elites that it can continue with even more intensity. For example, right after the invasion of Panama, Elliott Abrams, who'd been in charge of Latin American affairs under the Reagan administration, he pointed out that this is the first invasion in which the United States was able to use force without fear that it would lead to superpower conflict. So therefore we're more free to use force and violence. The point is that the Soviet deterrent has been removed. The Soviet Union is no longer containing the United States as it had done before, so we're freer to carry out our Cold War policies. Now, all of these are factors that lie in the background of the current relationship between the military and technology. It doesn't develop in a vacuum. It develops in terms of systems of power and domination that make use of technology to advance their aims, quite naturally.
Well, especially in this country, there is a new trend. I mean, also, a lot of people have been talking about the possibility of regaining the edge. And so I think, in a way, there is some opposition against this tendency.
Yeah.
Do you think that because of the new situation, I mean, what is going to happen?
Well, there's a kind of an internal contradiction.
Yeah.
For example, about 1980, 10 years ago, there was a very broad consensus in elite circles that it was necessary to It's not one thing. I guess they're taking businessmen around from one place to another. Okay? Where were we?
Well, you were talking about this kind of internal.
Oh, yeah,
contradiction.
okay.
Some
Right, yeah, I remember.
Probably.
Okay?
Okay.
Well, there is a kind of an internal contradiction that the state business nexus of power has to face. If we go back about, say, 10 years, late 1970s, there was a very broad elite consensus that more military spending was needed in order to stimulate the economy. And in fact, the Carter administration proposed a rapid increase in military spending and a decline in social programs, and the Reagan administration carried out those plans with a lot of business support. They assumed that they would have the classic effect of stimulating the economy. However, it didn't quite work that way. This is now a different world. The United States, in earlier years, the United States essentially dominated the international economy, but that's no longer true. It's only one of the players. The Japanese-based and German-based systems are true competitors today. It's really a tripolar world. Military spending is extremely inefficient. It's much more efficient to get the public to subsidize advanced technology the Japanese way. Namely, you simply have or the German way. I mean, there's planning done by financial industrial conglomerates working together with the state, and they simply set the level of investment and determine the mode of production, and the population does it. Now, in a society that's sufficiently obedient and docile, you can do that. You just order people to cut down their level of consumption because this is where the money's going to go, and they do it. You can't do that in the United States. It's a much freer and more independent society. You basically have to deceive people into doing the same thing. That's why the military system is so valuable. But by the early 1980s, it was already becoming clear that this method was not really working. The costs of the Reagan program were severe, as is well known. And by about 1983, 1984, business leaders were calling on the Reagan administration to cut back military spending because it was just too harmful to the economy. That's what happened. The military spending cut back and kind of leveled off by the mid-1980s, largely for internal domestic reasons. So we now have faced the following problem. Military spending is the optimal means to subsidize private enterprise for the reasons mentioned. On the other hand, it's an inefficient means, and other competitors are not using that inefficient means. They're producing directly for the market. Well, let's make it concrete. Suppose you want to design, lasers for the commercial market. Well, the Japanese method is for MIT, the industry of technology and so on, for MIT to bring together major conglomerates and to decide how to invest to design lasers for the commercial market. In the United States, what happens is the government calls upon industry to produce a system which can use lasers to shoot down missiles thousands of miles in space, and they hope that somehow out of this will come something that's usable for the commercial market. Well, there's no question who's going to win in that competition. So the United States is locked into a contradiction. Because of the relative freedom here and the independence of the country, you can't simply order people to cut back their standard of living and while the state uses their taxes to subsidize private industry. You have to do it in some devious fashion, fear of the Russians or fear of drugs or something like that. Whereas in a society that actually, to be honest about it, has a more fascist culture, and that's true of Japan, they don't have to bother with that. They can produce directly for the commercial market. The European society, every country has its own way of dealing with these problems. They depend on cultural patterns and the way popular forces are organized and all sorts of things. I mean, you can't generalize. I mean, the same problem exists everywhere, and there are different ways of dealing with it. In the United States, the problem is quite severe, and there is now the question that you raised. Do we continue with the inefficient mode of compelling the public to, or at least inducing the public to subsidize private power through the military and thereby fall behind their rivals? Or do we find some other method which will interfere with the rights and power of business? Now, those are two unpalatable alternatives from the point of view of the business classes who run the government and own the society. And how they'll deal with that is not clear.
Can we talk a little bit about the relationship between science and technology? And
Well, the relation between science and technology is
stai leggendo?
Questo no?
Sì, quello piccolo che era un attimo di...
Ok.
Scamming, helicopter scam.
Okay.
Well, as is well known, the relationship between science and technology has changed considerably over the years. Probably until about the mid-19th century, their relations were rather loose. The practical craft of doing things was so far ahead of theoretical understanding that science didn't contribute very much to it. If you wanted to make something or build something, you didn't go to a physicist to give you any advice. This began to change with the development of thermodynamics and internal and combustion engines and so on and so forth. But as late as the First World War, the main technological, Edison, main American inventor, had very little scientific background, offered his services to the War Department. They weren't particularly interested, and science had, the relation of science and technology was still kind of loose. As the years went by, things have been gradually changing. Science now has direct consequences which affect contemporary technology, and to a certain extent, it's debatable how much, but to a certain extent, scientific research inquiry is driven by external demands, by technological demands. It's true of parts of physics. It's in the last couple of decades, it's been true to a certain extent of biology. At the same time, science typically continues to be internally driven, that is, driven by the kinds of questions that arise in its own quest for understanding. Well, though you can see the changes, just take a look at a place like MIT. When I got here in the mid-1950s, this was an engineering school. Students were taught how to make things. They were taught how to build bridges and wire circuits and so on and so forth. By 10 years later, it was really a science university. It was understood that there wasn't much point in teaching students the current state of technology, because by the time they became active in the world of industrial engineering or whatever, that technology would already be outdated. And the only thing that made any sense was to teach them basic science so that then they would have enough understanding to cope with the new technology when it came along. In other words, there's not much point teaching people, training people in vacuum tube technology if 5 years from now they're going to be replaced by transistors. What they have to do is understand fundamental science so they'll be able to do whatever comes along. And that happened. If you get a degree in electrical engineering at MIT these days, your courses are not very different from those that you would get in the physics department. A little bit more applied, maybe, a little less fundamental nuclear physics, but it's more or less the same. You have to have mathematics and physics, and if you want to work in biotechnology, you have to know fundamental biology, and you have to be ready to deal with whatever the changes are going to be, unpredictable changes in the coming years. In that respect, in fact, MIT at that point began losing its classical engineering departments. So if you want to build bridges or so on, you don't study it at MIT anymore. You study it at some other engineering school. And that reflects a significant change in the relation between science and technology. Here it's been rather dramatic. This is now more a science university than a technology university, even though it still has an electrical engineering department and an aeronautical engineering department and so on, which when you look at them are very close to advanced contemporary science.
Very interesting. Yeah, I never thought about this point of view. Yeah. So in a way, they are going back, instead of studying a very narrow field, they give you a very broad fundamental, general training, so that then you will be able to specialize in a narrow field.
You'll not only be able to specialize, but you'll be able to keep up with subsequent changes. I mean, a couple of generations ago, you could assume that technology would remain relatively stable through your lifetime. If you were trained in a certain technology, you could apply it for the rest of your life, more or less. That's not the case anymore in many fields. You can expect technological changes to be rapid and abrupt and sometimes even fundamental, and unless you have a grasp of the basic underlying science that's feeding these developments, you'll not be able to function as an engineer in a future period. And for this reason, you still have to learn your trade. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But it's a rather different trade than it used to be because of the pace of scientific change and because of the much more intimate linkage between science and technology.
Let's go back to the bomb. From your point of view, which one were the reasons of the decision of dropping not only one but two bombs?
Well, I think that the reasons were probably different in the two cases. The second bomb was essentially the most grotesque experiment that was ever conducted in human history. They sort of wanted to see if it would work. There was no, it had a different design and so on. And it had almost no effect on the outcome of the war. They could have waited a few more days to have the Japanese surrender. The major discussion about the issue, therefore, has to do with the Hiroshima bomb, not the Nagasaki bomb. People would prefer not to talk about that for obvious reasons. The Hiroshima bomb, it's complex. I mean, if you accepted the premise that the United States was going to have to invade and occupy Japan, and that this would be a costly invasion, both to the American forces and to the population, then you could make maybe a sort of an argument on the basis of cost effectiveness to employ the bomb. And in part that was the assumption. On the other hand, the fundamental assumptions are very questionable. For one thing, Japan was quite close to collapse, and they knew it. I mean, Japan had been making offers for surrender. It had offered through the Russians to surrender with the sole condition, really, that the emperor be maintained in place. The United States didn't accept that. Furthermore, the Russians were coming into the war in early August. That had been planned months earlier. Everyone knew that that was going to have a major effect on destroying what was left of Japanese ground armies and ground forces. So if you assume that the United States was right in trying to win unconditional victory, if you accept that, it's still very unclear that the use of the bomb was necessary or even important. It certainly did have the effect of preventing the Russians from entering the war. The earlier plan between Roosevelt and Stalin had been that the Russians would enter the war, I think, on August 8th or approximately then, and they were planning to do so, but by July, it was understood that the United States could win the war alone if it used the bomb, and that would keep the Russians out, and then the United States would dominate Japan, and it was hoped all of Asia. The United States had been working through the war to prevent England, particularly, from participating in the development of Asia after the Second World War, and it certainly didn't want the Russians participating. So that was part of the reason for using the bombs. It accelerated the termination of the war and kept the Russians out. Another motive, it's debated how significant it was, but anyway, likely motive is that this would be regarded as threatening to the Russians. It would perhaps be a sort of a weapon that could be used in the post-war conflicts. Notice that all of this is based on the assumption that the United States had the right to occupy and defeat Japan. And that's not such an obvious assumption either. The Second World War was not like, in Asia, was not the way it was in Europe. In Europe, it was pretty clear, I mean, no doubt where the war guilt lay. I mean, you can trace it back to the inequities of the Versailles Treaty and so on, make all sorts of complicated arguments, but Hitler was sui generis. That was a special phenomenon. I mean, sort of an ultimate, if anything can have the name ultimate evil, that was it. And the aggression was straightforward. It was kind of unproblematic. Made very good sense to destroy Hitler Germany from any point of view. On the other hand, the war in Asia was a much more complex affair. It in part had its roots in, it was more like the First World War. I mean, it had its roots in inter-imperial rivalries, where the rights and wrongs of the situation were by no means obvious. Japanese expansion in Asia was very brutal, but it was not without cause. It was largely a response to the fact that the West was unwilling to play the capitalist game as soon as the Japanese started beating them at it. So England, for a century, had been lauding the virtues of free enterprise as long as it was going to win in the competition. But by the 1920s, it wasn't winning anymore. It was being undercut by Japanese production, so the game was called off. That game is only, the only advocates of free enterprise ever are the ones who know they're going to win because of their power. As soon as they know they're not going to win, they're not interested in free enterprise anymore. That's a weapon against the weak. Nobody intends it for themselves. It's true today as well. When the Japanese began to be too competitive, England effectively closed off the empire. In 1932, there was a conference in Ottawa which raised duties on Japanese imports to imperial countries, to India and others, to such a level that Japan simply couldn't import. The United States, which was a smaller empire in those days, did the same thing. The United States blocked Japanese imports to the Philippines and to Cuba and the Caribbean, places where it could effectively control them. The Dutch did the same thing. The Japanese talked at the time about A, B, C, D encirclement, American, British, Chinese, Dutch encirclement, and there was some reason for that. They were being, since they were doing too well in trade and production, they had to be controlled, and the way to control them was for the West to use its force, basically, to block them from expansion. Furthermore, the West largely controlled their resources. Japan is a very resource-poor island chain. It needs energy and other resources from elsewhere, and those happen to be in the hands of the Western imperialist powers, Holland, England, and the United States. So Japan was in fact trapped. There were very few options available to them, and that's part of the background of, and this continued right up to Pearl Harbor. I mean, in the last discussions between the United States and the Japanese, Admiral Nomura and Secretary of State Hull, leading right up to a week before the Pearl Harbor attack, the debate was over the conditions. The basic question was simply, would Japan agree to open up the areas under its control to free American penetration? The United States was not opposed to the Japanese invasion of China. In fact, in the early 30s, it essentially supported it, but it didn't want any interference with U.S. rights to exploit China. And the question is whether Japan would open up Manchuria and China to U.S. penetration. And the Japanese actually offered to do that right up to shortly before Pearl Harbor, but they insisted on a reciprocal move on the part of the United States. They insisted that the United States open up its imperial domains to Japanese penetration. And the American negotiators, Secretary Hull, just regarded this as absurd. I mean, how dare these lowly Orientals demand that we reciprocate and open up our areas for penetration? I mean, they're just dirt. We tell them what to do. We don't ask them what to do. There was a big racist streak in this as well. And this discussion goes right up to the opening of the war. Now, these are also factors that have to be borne in mind, and they raise rather complicated questions about the right to conquer Japan altogether. But even if we accept that, even if we accept all the ideological premises under which the war was fought and is today described, even if we accept that whole ideological baggage, as virtually everyone does, wrongly in my view, but as virtually everyone does, then still the question, there's a tactical question, whether the use of the bomb was a tactically advisable device to achieve the victory, which we're now assuming was justified, although I don't accept it. And even in that narrow sphere, I think I would agree with people like, say, Eisenhower and others who thought it was just an outright horror. In fact, if I can add a personal reminiscence, when I was about, 15, I guess, when the bomb fell, and I was up in a summer camp somewhere where I was a counselor, and when I heard the news, I found it so devastating, and I also found I couldn't talk to anybody about it because everyone was cheering. I just took off and walked into the woods and sat there alone for 4 or 5 hours, and to this day I've never been able to talk to anybody about it. I cannot understand how people were able to come to terms with that and even cheer it as they did. The reaction to the use of the bomb is absolutely unbelievable. I'll add another personal. A couple of years later, about 1950, here in Boston, my wife and I noticed an advertisement for a movie called Hiroshima, and it was being played in what was called the combat zone. It's an area in downtown Boston where they play pornographic films and sell drugs and have gambling and criminals and so on. And we couldn't figure out what's this film, Hiroshima, doing in the pornographic film area. So we decided to go down and have a look. We went, and it turned out to be a documentary, Japanese-made documentary, of the Hiroshima bombing, with live photographs of what was happening to the people under the bombing, people fleeing with their skin falling off and all kind of horrors. And the audience was treating it as a pornographic film. They were sitting there and laughing. This was 5 years later. I mean, it's just unimaginable. I mean, unless you look at modern history, it's unimaginable. You look at modern history, unfortunately, it's not so unimaginable.
We were talking before about racism, and all the propaganda films that have been made during the war. Do you think that also racism did play a role in the dropping of the bomb?
Now, these are very hard things to estimate and to prove, but my sense is very definitely yes. Again, I was a young teenager at the time, but I have very vivid memories of the wartime propaganda, striking memories because of the dramatic difference between the portrayal of the Germans and the portrayal of the Japanese. The Nazis, by any measure, were monstrous, far more monstrous than the Japanese. And it was known at the time. I mean, people may not have known the details about the Holocaust, but you knew enough. The Germans were portrayed with a sort of a degree of respect in the wartime propaganda movies. They were, after all, blonde Aryans, the kind of people we're supposed to admire. And even if they'd somehow taken the wrong track and you could make fun of Hitler, Charlie Chaplin could mock Hitler, nevertheless, there was a level of respectful treatment in the portrayal of the Germans, who, of course, we were going to defeat and destroy. The Japanese, on the other hand, were subhuman. I mean, they were just vermin. They were depicted as insects you crush, I mean, they weren't even human beings. Maybe they had vague resemblance to human beings, but that was misleading. In fact, the treatment of the Japanese fit very naturally into a strain of American culture that goes way back to the 17th century. That's the way the native population was described. The native population were beasts in human guise, wolves who looked like men, as George Washington put it. And when you have to totally destroy and annihilate people, when you have to commit genocide, you have to prove that they're not human, otherwise you can't do it. And that's what was done in the conquest of the hemisphere, in fact, and certainly the conquest of the U.S. national territory. Effectively, it required something like genocide. And in order to carry that out with extreme brutality, you had to show that it wasn't human beings that you were kicking out, somebody else. Now, that's a deep strain actually in Western culture, but in particular in American culture. It's been regularly applied when needed. So when the United States conquered the Philippines in the early part of the century, killing hundreds of thousands of Filipinos, they were described as niggers who had to be wiped out. Just like, and in fact, the war was led by Indian fighters who just carried over the same techniques. And this strain is revived right during the Second World War. The treatment of the Japanese fit into that pattern, continued during the Vietnam War as well. In fact, continues to this day. You know, when you take a look at the way Noriega's described. I mean, granted, Noriega is a thug, but it's very interesting to watch the way he's described on American television or on the the radio and so on. Noriega's first of all, he's a minor thug by American standards as compared with the people the United States supports. He looks relatively benign, so it's not his. And the United States was supporting him even when they knew he was a minor criminal. But the depiction of him is remarkable. For example, when he was in the Vatican embassy, the American reporters were in high-rise buildings nearby, you know, looking at the interesting scenes, and one of the television channels, the reporters hung a pineapple out of their window overlooking the embassy. Well, the reason is Noriega his face is pockmarked, so people mocked him as looking like a pineapple. So the television reporters, these are the objective, journalists, they hung a pineapple out their window. Now, on National Public Radio, which is the radio for the elite, educated audience, there was a segment, a 10-minute segment or so, in which one of the reporters interviewed a fruit and vegetable salesman, asking him, does Noriega really look like a pineapple? Now this is going out to the elite, educated audience, not the mobs, and apparently that passes without any notice. I mean, it's just racist contempt. And of course, he's half Indian, and his support came from largely the black and Indian part of the population. There was a big class and race issue in this. And this is all just natural, it's kind of like the natural racism. I mean, they even get it in the documentary record. So if you look at the early planning documents after the Second World War, when the State Department was planning the organization of the post-war world, you get to the treatment of Africa. George Kennan, who wrote these reports, he was head of the policy planning group. When he gets to Africa, he says, look, we don't really need Africa. We're going to take most of the world and kick out the British and the French and so on, because they don't have any rights anymore. But Africa is not very interesting for us, so we can hand it over to the Europeans to exploit. The idea that to exploit for their own development. Well, you might suggest that maybe Africa should exploit Europe for its development. There'd be some historical justification for that, but that couldn't enter anybody's mind. And so Southern Europe is treated the same way. You take a look at the State Department planning records for Italy, which was subjected to very severe American intervention, because the United States wanted to destroy the labor movement and to restore the old traditional order and so on. They were very worried about the 1948 election. In fact, the United States planned military intervention in case the communists won legally in the 1948 election. They took it very seriously. But the policies were designed to exploit the fact that people were starving after the war and so on, to control food and to reinstitute fascist police and so on. And you look at the State Department records, and one of the officers says, we have to design the policy in such a way that the dumbest wop will understand who they're supposed to vote for. And that's the way you look at subject people. They're to be kicked in the pants, and the Japanese particularly. The Italians are sort of halfway, they're wops, but they're sort of half human. The Japanese were not even human. They're just Asians,
We were talking before, and you were telling me that also that this idea of civilization, destroying the native, this kind of racism was brought practically from Europe.
Yeah. I mean, Europe is a very savage and barbaric society. I mean, we could ask why, but there's no doubt about the fact. I mean, as this plague of European civilization spread over the world, it simply destroyed everything in its path. The Europeans did not have a major technological advantage in the early phases of European conquest. So, for example, when the British conquered India, they were not technologically much more advanced, or maybe, than, say, the Chinese, who could have developed a technology to conquer India. But the British had the advantage of extreme savagery, and that's very useful when you're attacking someone. It's just a different kind of war. Right here in New England, it was exactly the same thing. The native population certainly had the capacity to destroy the colonists, but the colonists mastered European savagery, and they knew how you fight a war. The way the native population fought a war, it was kind of symbolic. You have braves on the field of battle, and a few people get killed, and it's over. The Europeans understood that that's not the way you fight a war. You wait until the men leave the village, and then you go in and you murder all the women and children and burn it down. That's the way you fight a war. And the native population had to learn that. It took a long time before they understood the European method of conquest, which was different. It's not that there wasn't savagery in the Western Hemisphere. The Aztecs were very brutal and so on, but the European style was different. And it may have come out of, probably comes out of the history of Europe, which is, after all, a history of savage warfare, for hundreds of years. After all, the only reason it ended in 1945 is because the next step would have been the destruction of everything. The history of Europe is one of barbarous internal fighting and expansion of the same culture over the rest of the world with devastating effects. And the conquest of the Western Hemisphere is an example of that. Actually, there's a book that just appeared, or is appearing, in Germany called The 500-Year Reich, which is a commemoration of the 500 years of since Columbus's so-called discovery of America. And of course, the analogy is to Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. This one's lasted 500 years, and the modalities of conquest are not very different. In fact, Hitler actually referred to them. Part of the Nazis' justification for their own viciousness was to point out that the colonists in the Western Hemisphere had done pretty much the same thing.
What about the idea of progress, civilization? What do you think of that?
Well, you can look, if you're an optimist, you can look over human history and detect progress. There's no doubt about that. So take something like, say, slavery. Throughout virtually all of human history, literal human slavery was considered legitimate and, in fact, praiseworthy. Slavery was, after all, justified on moral grounds. Just as you can't let a 3-year-old child run across the street, it would be unfair to allow these childlike semi-humans to control their own affairs. They'll get in too much trouble. So we're good to them. We make them slaves. We take care of them. They benefit. They're much better off than free labor, which will just get exploited. There's some logic to that, incidentally. And so it was actually justified. It's only in the last few centuries that this has been regarded as abominable. By now, in most of the world, it's regarded as inconceivable. That's a big moral change. And even in our own lifetimes, we can see similar things happening. Take, say, the relation between men and women. Exploitation of women and subordination of women was considered totally natural in cultivated, educated circles not long ago. Well, it still goes on, but now there's recognition that there's at least a problem, that maybe it's not obvious. And that's a moral change. And there are many such things through human history. The right of people to participate in their own, in controlling their own lives, to have a democratic political system. That's it doesn't work anywhere, except in very limited ways. But it's recognized as a value to be achieved. That's pretty recent in human history, last couple hundred years. And in many other respects, I think we can see an expansion of the realm of moral understanding as people begin to, I would take this to mean that they're just exploring their own moral natures and learning more about it. And, whatever arguments you can give for slavery, you realize at some point that it's just a totally incompatible with our basic concept of a human being that the person can be owned. I mean, it happens because of social changes and economic changes and so on. All sorts of things interact, but the effect is an expansion of the moral realm. And along with it go some slow changes in social and political structures as struggling people demand more and struggle to attain their rights. These things don't come because somebody hands them down. They come out of struggle. Take, say, freedom of speech. That's a big change over the last couple hundred years. In just about every country in the world, including the United States and England, up until quite recently, it was considered a crime to assault the state by words. That is, to criticize power was a crime, seditious libel it's called. In fact, it wasn't really struck down by the Supreme Court in the United States till 1964. And in fact, truth was no defense, makes the crime worse because you're demeaning power even more if you make a true criticism of power. Well, you know, by now, at least in the United States, and maybe only in the United States, that's now been eliminated from the law. There's been an expansion of freedom of speech and the protection for it in the United States over the last couple of centuries. Now, you know, notice that theoretically these things are in the Bill of Rights, but that's just theoretical. James Madison pointed out that what he called a parchment barrier will never stand in the way of tyranny. People have to struggle for their rights and fight for them and defend them. And over the last couple of centuries, through the struggles of the labor movement and the peace movement and the women's movement and so on, these rights have been extended. And by now in the United States, they're pretty substantial, more so than in any country of the world that I know of. But that's the result of popular struggle. And the same is true of, and it does get institutionalized at a point. And the same is true of everything else you can think of. I mean, the rights of labor, limited as they are, were not handed down by anyone and were not written on pieces of paper. No parchment barrier could hand them down. You have to struggle for them and fight for them and continue to do that. And as that goes on, there is an expansion of both understanding and the social institutions that reflect the right to freedom and independence and the illegitimacy of authority and domination. You can be hopeful if you want. On the other hand, a pessimist could look at the same record and conclude that, as I said before, this is just a lethal mutation. Just a matter of time before it destroys itself and much else with it. It has too much capacity for destruction and not enough intelligence to control that. I'm going to have to leave.